The TGR_insert_employee trigger has been doing a good job of keeping all of the inserts that take place to the employee table also happening to the inserts in the employee history table. Now let's look at one particular employee and example. Now employee number 11, Sally Smith. That also appears as employee number 11 in the employee history table, Sally Smith. Now, Sally has some interesting news. She's going to tie the knot with the Mr. Bowler that she has fallen in love with, and being the traditional gal that she is, she's going to accept his last name. So let's make this update statement and verify that her name is now Sally Bowler. Select star from DBO employee where empid equals 11. Hooray for the big day! Let's just go ahead and look at our history table. And let's see how employee 11 appears in the employee history table. Hey, it still says Sally Smith. That's because the insert trigger ignores updates. So what if we wanted to keep these two tables in tandem? Well, here's an idea. We can create a trigger called TGR_UpdateEmployee, and we're going to set it on the DBO employee table. And we're going to say after the update takes place, we have a begin and an end statement. Now all of the code we want to run will go between the begin and the end. We'll put update DBO employee history, and we're going to set last name equal to e.lastname from the employee history table, which I'll alias as EH, interjoined to the inserted table as E. And we'll do this on EH employee ID being common between the two. Okay, let's run this statement. It says commands completed successfully. Now, let's see how this works. Let's update the employee table. We're going to set the last name equal to Xander. Sally said, hey, it wasn't Bowler, his last name was Xander. You entered it wrong. Please re-enter it. Okay, let's make this update one more time. It says one row affected twice. Well, let's see if it shows up as Xander on the employee table and as Xander on the employee history table. Just how are update triggers useful for data integrity? Well, let's take the example of the stateless table. And we really only have a few changes we might ever make to this, like adding a state every 25 years or maybe changing the landmass or borders for a state. Again, that doesn't happen very often, so we're not going to do massive changes to the stateless table. Let's take this example. Let's say we entered a contract with Russia and they have sold us a 50-square-mile island near the Aleutian chain, but we see useful for our fishing business. So, the landmass of Alaska is going to increase by 50 square miles thanks to the acquisition of this new island. So I guess it will be 665,475 instead of 425 after this has been run. Let's run this statement. It only affected one row because only one state acquired a new island, and here we are at 475 for the last three digits. Now, accidentally, we could have run this update statement without the criteria, and every state's landmass would have been updated. Since changes to the stateless table are very uncommon, we're going to limit it so that only one state can be updated at a time. Very similar to what we did with the delete trigger. Now, some changes should never happen. For example, once a state ID is set, let's say that we can't change it intentionally or accidentally. So we're going to put a safety catch in there where we're going to say update state list set ID equals AS where the state is equal to AK. This should be forbidden. This would be allowed right now if I were to run it. But here's what we want to do. We want to create a very complicated trigger that does two things. Number one, it checks to make sure that you are not going to update more than one state at a time. And number two, it will never allow updates to the state ID field, but the other fields will be allowed. How are we going to lock that down? Well, let's start off by creating a trigger called TGR update state list, and we'll put it on the state list table. It's an after update trigger, and we're going to put as begin end. Now remember, the update trigger is the only trigger that creates two resident memory tables, the inserted and deleted tables. So let's start off by saying, if I count more than one record that has been changed, that's forbidden, so I'm going to roll it back. All right? That'll work just fine. What about the other objective, where we say, if exists? In other words, if I find a record where the inserted and deleted tables seem to have a different value on the state ID field, I don't want to allow that either. Well, how do we find out if two fields don't match? Well, we're going to do a left join, where the inserted is left joined to the deleted table on the state ID field. Now, if there is an unmatch between them, that means I will find a null value in the deleted field. If I find even one of these, then we're going to roll back the transaction. Let's run this statement to create the trigger. It says commands completed successfully. All right, let's see if this helps us. The first part of this statement says you cannot update more than one record at a time. So this update statement that changes the landmass of every state causes that if statement in the trigger to fire off. And indeed, it denies us from doing this. The if exists code inside of the trigger says if you make an update and the deleted table and the inserted table have a different ID, disallow it. So this update statement, trying to change Alaska from AK to AS, causes that if statement in the trigger to fire off and roll back the transaction. How about a change that would be allowed? Well, this update statement is only affecting one field, and the field being affected is not the state ID field. Run it, and you see the transaction completes. Lab 2.3, skill check 1. Create a trigger called TRG_update pay rates, which updates all fields of the pay rates history table based on changes to the pay rates table. Test the trigger by updating the yearly salary of employee ID 11 to $150,000 per year. Skill check 2. Create a trigger called TRG update grant, which will not allow you to make updates to the existing values of the grant ID field. Skill check 3. Sometimes updates are made to the sales invoice detail table. These updates request a new order date for an existing sales invoice. After a change is made to the sales invoice detail table, you need to update the sales invoice updated date field to reflect the current date and time. Write a trigger named UPD sales invoice detail to achieve this goal. Test your trigger by updating invoice ID 1 to have a 5-cent unit discount, the upper figure of 2.6. Check to see that the sales invoice table has the newer timestamp, as seen in the figure here.